Welcome to Panic at the Discourse. My name is Edwin Kemp Attrill. I'm not the host of the show, but I wanted to be here on the first episode and start the conversation off to welcome the amazing people that we have here today, and to be a bit more of a part of the first episode. In the future episodes, I'm mostly going to be in the corner. I'm going to be able to do some fact checking and load up videos and stuff like that. But maybe to start with, I'll just say that we're on the land of the Kaurna people. We're filming inside the Replay Creative Office, which is inside Rumpus, which is in Adelaide, South Australia. This is the first episode, and it's an opportunity for us to talk pretty casually about what we hope this project can be, or what we understand it to be, and to introduce ourselves a little bit more to the people that are watching or who are listening, before we go into the next episode, which will be a more formal review.
And we're all theatre people.
Yes, that is true.
We all love the theatre. And I certainly want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Talk about what we see, what we hear, and what we haven't said elsewhere.
In what way are you a theatre person?
Oh, I didn't discover the theatre until I was 28. That is, it was around my life, but not as a passion. I didn't discover it from the inside out until I was quite old.
Did you study? Did you go to university?
Yes. But I got my BA in philosophy, my MA in English literature. So I knew, my family was, my aunts were in the Elks. Who are the wives of the Elks? The ladies' auxiliary.
Mm-hmm. Fact check that, Ed.
Yeah. And so they had a band, a kitchen band, and that was my childhood theater experience, was going to the community halls with my aunts, and the uncles all carried the baggage and things, and costumes, lots of costumes, and they'd perform in all these community halls in various places with a piano player who played like that, and magicians and all kinds of things. So I loved all of that a lot. But we wouldn't formally recognize it's a performance. So yes, I've had a hunger for performance my entire life.
Good. And you're PJ Rose.
And I am PJ Rose. Thank
you. Jules,
yes.
Do you want to... Yeah.
So I'm Juliana Nixon, also you can call me Jules. So if we're going that far back, my first interest was wanting to be Hilary Duff in the early 2000s. When I thought that wouldn't pan out, I tried...
Who was Hilary Duff?
Oh, jeez. Okay, Disney Channel star in the early 2000s, Ed.
Right.
Okay, then I decided to do musical theatre, and I played Maria in West Side Story, and that was my peak. I loved it.
You'd be a great Maria.
Listen, I'm pretty sure that's why they gave me the role. Sort of Latin-looking, great. And then that was in Borneo, and when I moved to Australia, I looked for drama schools, and I was here in Adelaide, and I went to drama school about 9 years ago. So that's when I sort of got into the theatre of it all, the Stanislavski, and that was all very foreign to me because I just wanted to sing and be the centre of attention. And it made me think about that. And actually, I've taken a break from theatre and I do filmmaking, and I've actually transitioned again into social work. And I'm really keen to explore the performing arts because it's been a while since I've really thought deeply about that time of my life. And I feel like there's a lot to say, and I'm really interested in what PJ and Ben think about criticism and the performing arts.
Nice. I'm Ben Brooker. I'm a theatre critic, playwright, dramaturg, and various other things. It's really lovely, actually, just hearing from PJ and Jules about their kind of openings in terms of theatre, and I think it's actually a really lovely note to start on of PJ's, which is about kind of that foundational love of theatre, which I have as well, but sometimes as a critic it's really easy to feel jaded and you forget that. But then sometimes I kind of think my whole kind of life as a critic and as a performer is kind of chasing the feeling that I would get from shows that I saw when I was much younger, and particularly that sense of magic that I only ever got from theatre, which was kind of that sense of seeing stuff on stage and you didn't know how it was done, and yet it was happening in front of you in three-dimensional space. And that feeling of just being blown away. Like one of my foundational experiences in this respect was it was a family holiday to the UK, and Dad had taken us to the Garrick Theatre in the West End in London, and Stephen Daldry's revival of An Inspector Calls was on. And like many years later, I found out that this was quite a signature kind of work at the time, but back then, of course, I didn't know anything about it. And it was this kind of hoary old kind of amateur theatre kind of favourite, but he did it in a really interesting way. And there was this astonishing moment where there was this kind of this huge house on stage, and at sort of the end of the first act, when everything is kind of falling apart for this family, the house kind of lifts up on these hydraulics, and it kind of comes forward, and everything in the house kind of falls out onto the stage, and there's kind of smoke and kind of fireworks going off, and I was just absolutely just transfixed. And I think in a way that feeling still holds, and occasionally you'll see something and you'll go, yes, I can feel that it's still in there somewhere. So in a way, I think it's important to remind yourself of that, because you do see so much work that doesn't measure up. But I always feel like, and I always say that I think criticism fundamentally is an act of love, or it should be an act of love, or that's the place that it's coming out of. It's not shitting on something. It's saying, I love the form of theatre so much, and you broke my heart by not being everything that I know you can be. And I think that's fundamentally for me where that instinct comes from to critique. And it's hard to talk about, because I nearly said criticize them, but then criticize sounds it's got such negative connotations. But maybe that's something, we should talk about at some point, because I think that's definitely a part of this conversation, this kind of debate about discourse. What's the language we use? How do we talk about theatre? How do we do it constructively? And I think that's stuff that I'm keen to get into on the podcast.
Yeah. And I think essentially this project is about how do we talk about talking about theatre, and how do we talk about theatre in a digital age, in a way, in an era that doesn't have print media as much as it used to be, and also that we have access to video documentation of theatre shows, which is now kind of pretty reliable, that most shows will have video documentation. And so it means that the idea of this project to me is about how can we use that documentation to support the conversation about theatre, and do it online where there's not a 250 word count or a 6-minute segment or whatever it is, but it can actually be a bit more kind of free flowing. I should mention as well, so just for the sake of the listeners, the watchers, Replay Creative does do video documentation. So, for example, the next episode where we're going to be talking about Grief Lightning, that's something that we've documented. Not all the projects that we're going to be talking about are things that we've documented. And also, this project it's not the voice of Replay Creative. We're the kind of technical side behind it, but really it's the voice of the people that are in the room. So that's a bit of a way of saying the views do not, reflect the views of Replay Creative.
Just our opinion.
Yeah, but that's not because I don't, support it. It's to give you authority to actually say what you want to say, and for me to not feel like I have to kind of editorialize it or pull it back or anything like that. Like I want this, the whole point of this is to be honest, but to also be supportive and to not tear people up in the process.
I know exactly what you mean, Ben, about that feeling. Do you, Jules?
Yes.
Which feeling?
You said it so well. I don't remember your exact words, but that feeling that takes you out of everything. And what I want to know is, have you ever had that experience on television or in another medium? Mm. I don't know if I have.
Yeah, what I was describing to me feels specific to theatre, and it's something about, I know these are cliches to some extent, but it's that thing about being in the same physical space as other people at the same time. And, we know that there are various kind of physiological things that happen when that happens. So I think that's a part of it. And obviously I just think there's that sort of, this is why, Ed, you were talking about kind of, theatre's digital response to I suppose, COVID and various other things. But I think fundamentally, theatre is a live medium, and that means it's risky and it's dangerous. And that's also, I think, a part of the appeal. I think that's a part of why it's exciting. And yeah, PJ, I think that for me, that's a partial answer to your question, I guess.
I think this is even more cliche, but I think to me it's around magic. And like I feel really awkward saying that because I'm not a superstitious or sentimental person, but as I've gotten older, I feel more and more comfortable acknowledging that there is this feeling of magic that you get in certain spaces, and to me, you kind of get something similar in some film kind of stuff, but it's not the same. Like there is something, magic. There can be something magical about when you see theatre, and it's really good.
Because I think as much as it's possible, it's an unmediated medium. You're not, there's sort of nothing between you and the people who are creating the thing that you're engaging with. So in that sense, it feels to me more immersive than any other form. I mean, immersive, again, a cliche and an overused word. And, and one of my problems with, I think, the idea of, because everything is immersive these days, everything gets described as immersive, it's such a buzzword. But it's interesting because I feel like some work that's genuinely immersive, like when you're, literally surrounded by actors, for example, doesn't feel as kind of all-encompassing as work that's on a stage many meters away in some ways. So I think there's something, again, there's just something in the alchemy of that sort of transmission between audience and performer, which is, it doesn't require you to be that close to them. It's something else. There's some magic that's created in that space.
Yeah, like I think that can be overused, but I do think it is a spiritual thing. It's something that's elusive. It's not tangible. It's a feeling. It's a thought, and I think that's what's exciting when you try and talk about it, because you're chasing the right word. You're chasing the right description. It's almost like there isn't the language to describe what you guys experienced or what you experienced in that live performance. I've always found theatre really overwhelming, like sensory-wise. I think I have a sensory processing issue because I always want to run out. It's so overstimulating.
As an audience member.
Like I feel like so like a deluge of that electricity.
And when it's good, right? Not when it's bad. Yeah.
And I often find that I need to like have a 2-hour long bath or go for like a 2-hour walk after a play, because I just feel so like actors give this stuff to you and there's so much information and energy that's been given to you.
Wow. Would you be willing to talk about when you've had, just one example of when you've had that experience?
I thought of one while Jules was speaking, actually, and it was a production of a Sarah Kane play, 448 Psychosis.
Which one?
Many years ago.
There have been several local productions. Which one? Where?
It was at the Queen's Theatre. It may have been Border Project. Going back quite a long way, maybe early.
So Geordie.
2000s.
Yeah, I thought it might have been Geordie's.
It might have been.
Now.
I think it was.
Yeah. And I seem to remember that the staging was like a kind of sand pit in the Queen's Theatre, so like an empty shell kind of theatre. And I remember having a very intense and visceral reaction to that play, which is about, very serious mental illness. And I wanted to run out of the theatre. Like I've had that feeling about plays that are just so bad that you can't bear to be in the same space. But this was something it was almost bodily. It was like, I don't know how to be in this space with this material because it's so affecting. So that was one example that sprang to mind.
Yeah, I have one through drama school era, and it was a grad show called Punk Rock. And that
Simon Stevens?
Yeah. And I think Tom Healy directed. And Jim Smith was, the main character in that. That was like, I just was not expecting that. You kind of go into a grad show sort of like, you're out at Nando's with your friends before and you're all like, farting around. And then, we sat down for this, play about a really serious topic, guns in a school. And we were just like all clutching each other and like holding each other's face. And like, it was... Yeah, and we all had like the biggest night after, just talking about it for 3 hours and flopping onto the floor and like being really dramatic about it. Something about, and I can't remember the details, but that feeling I remember. I can go back and I almost start to get those feelings again because it's such a unique thing to experience. What about you, PJ?
the one that comes most easily to mind is seeing Sunday in the Park with George on Broadway. I had driven from Minneapolis to New York City in a snowstorm. And I don't know why I was doing this in the middle of winter. I didn't have a ticket. Drove up to the theater. And this is because a friend had said, "You've got to see this." So I don't know what I did with the car. I don't know anything, except I got there. I'm in line. And the people in front of me and they said, "Sorry, sold out." And I started to walk away. And the box office person said, "How many did you want?" I said, "Just one." And she said, so I got a fifth row center seat. It was like the last thing that they hadn't sold yet. And it was the most extraordinary thing, but it was an early version. I've seen many versions of Sunday in the Park with George, which, if not everybody else, is a musical by Stephen Sondheim, with directed by James Lapine. And James Lapine wrote the book. And there's a great description in Lapine's recent book of his collaboration with Stephen Sondheim. So I did not know what to expect. I had a CD in my car, probably a cassette tape actually, in my car, and listened across the country to these songs about which I knew nothing.
The story about the musical is so fascinating because it had a really kind of uncomfortable opening in its day because it was quite kind of radical in terms of the musical form.
And there is a recording of the production with Bernadette Peters, and what is his Mandy Patinkin is the lead male playing Surratt. It is just, I mean, a musical about a painter and his model. Basically is what it is. And and in some ways, it was so podunk because the images in the original painting, and they drove to Chicago to see the original, which is, the size of this building. So the trees would just pop up out of the ground on stage, right? Any character that wasn't there as an actor would pop up literally as a cardboard figure from the ground. Sometimes the trees would descend from the wings, from the gods. In the end, it's about art. It's about, and the conflict or the basic two values in the film, in the play, are children and art. Then the conflict is between Georges Seurat, who's painting and has no time, who just loves her a lot, but he can't not paint. He's just a wonderful obsessive, right? Painting all the time. And she, even though she loves George and loves his work, that's the big thing. She loves what he does. She loves what she sees. She goes off with the baker because when we see the play open, she's pregnant. So she decides to leave the artist and go with the baker because she can feed the kid. But in the end, her love is still with George and the art. So children and I could get tears thinking about it, that there's an entire musical written about the significance of the creative process, whether what finishes up is a child or a work of art. We've got to watch it together sometime.
Live commentary.
So came the interval, and I sat in my chair, and I just didn't want to leave the theater because I was so thrilled with this world, which made no sense to me, and I knew nothing about it. I couldn't have explained it. And the same was true at the very end, by the end. So at least we're all on that page, even though we haven't seen the same things. I'm very good thinking, Edwin.
Thank you.
Well produced.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something Jules said before, because you introduced a word that you were using the other day, which I find interesting because it's a word that I used to be very uncomfortable with, and I've grown more comfortable with it as I get older, which is spiritual.
Yeah.
And because you talked about your spiritual relationship to theatre. And I do putting you on the spot now. I do think it's worth underlining that, theatre's roots are in ritual and ceremony. And I think that's partly why it moves us so much. And I've got this kind of pet theory that in the West, we're so kind of starved of ritual and ceremony, of coming of age kind of ceremonies that are very kind of common in cultures throughout history. I think we've been denuded of them, and I think there's something within us that yearns for those things. And I think theatre does, at its best, I think it answers that. And I don't know if that's what you meant by using that word, Jules, but I was just curious.
Abso-friggin-lutely. Is this the word, secularization?
It is.
Great. That has been done throughout the West to just about every practice you can think of. And actually, it really struck me. I read this book for my social work course called The First Kiss by Daryl Chow, PhD, and it's about the first counselling appointment that you do as a counsellor or social worker. And he has these chapters that are sometimes just one paragraph long. And one of them was just get spiritual. Let's get rid of this idea that, therapy and human connection can be secularized. It's not. And I was just so overwhelmed that he was talking about psychotherapy in this way, or saying to lean into that spirituality, because you'd think, oh, is that unethical? That's not tangible? How could you go there with a client? Isn't there supposed to be this very stark boundary? But that's got me thinking about all of the practice that I've, done in my time and continue to want to do. And sometimes it's it's good because it's also permission to not think too much about things sometimes. You can just go, it is because it is. I felt that because I felt it. And I think it's helped me in my performing arts, personal practice. Something about just feeling at one with myself and going, okay, my intellect is trying to ruin this for me, and it's trying to take me in all these other directions, and I just have to have this third eye of myself going, no, you're doing that because you chose it, and that's it, let's move on.
There's that great essay, O for Unruly Audiences. I forget who the author is, but he talks about the way that he says that the relationship between theatre makers and audiences moved from patronage originally, where the audience were the artist needed the patronage of the audience, and so provided tea and coffee, and there was this kind of communal sense, to when I think it was post World War II, to when arts funding was established, and there needed to be this distinction between professional artists and amateurs, and therefore the professional artists had the expertise and they gave to the audiences what the audiences needed. And then he talks about the third kind of relationship with the audience, which is a consumer kind of relationship. But it's really interesting the way that it's not so much just the way that theatre is set up, but I think it's you can tell it in the kind of work that some artists make, where you go, I'm welcomed into this space and this is for a group of people, as opposed to just a product that is purchased and consumed. That some makers, I think, have that kind of attitude, and you get that feeling as an audience member of going, oh yeah, I'm part of something that they wanted me to be here. And yeah, to me that's really important.
Yeah, and it's not one direction, it's a symbiotic relationship. It's a flow of a connection.
Yeah.
I wonder if I might invite Ed and PJ to say a bit more about that in terms of your respective community theatre practices, because I think I see a lot of the kinds of work that I want to see in that space, and I react very strongly against work that feels like it's being made for the benefit of a privileged few. Is there something that you two would want to say to that?
I think there's a couple of things. One is I think you mentioned something similar, the way that for most of history, theatre and community were the same thing. This idea that theatre can be separate to community is strange.
Right.
That's a really kind of weird thing, particularly because theatre as an art form requires the audience to all come together at the same time and be there at the same time. It's built, I think, as a community kind of practice. I think, for example, in Adelaide, some of the best work has come from children's theatre. And that's because they understand that if they if they don't engage the audience, like directly engage them, then they've lost them. And I think so much bad theatre that I see takes the audience for granted and may as well be a film, you know? Like, it's like, why have we come together to be here? And maybe this is especially true post-COVID, but it's like the work that Children's Theatre Company has to produce, and this is separate to what I would consider community arts practice, but children's theatre generally does really exceptional work, and it's because they need to engage the audience. Yeah. But then I think, like, PJ, I think one of the great things that I've gotten from you, because when I was first employed in community arts context, that was through No Strings Attached Theatre of Disability that you were running, and you were completely adamant from the start that there's no reason why that theatre should be any less than any other kind of theatre, that it's still based on the same principles, and that there's a discipline to it, and that you need to kind of, you need to push people to achieve what they can achieve. And just because someone has a disability doesn't mean that they can achieve less. Like, you find what they're able to do, and when you find that, like, you have these moments of, and it's that kind of brilliant moment of theatre where you go, oh my God, I didn't know this could happen. And it happened because you just kind of, you aligned the pieces in the right way, and then it comes out.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So I think, to me that's, I think it's a shame that more art is not engaged more directly with communities, because I think when you are kind of forced, or when you have the opportunity to engage with the community, I think it generally makes your work better, because it has to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always been interested in the new, but not for news sake. Another one of those experiences, I was working on my PhD in, where was that? Denver, Colorado. And I really wanted to interview off-Broadway writers, because I'd seen some off-Broadway stuff. I was interviewing a playwright named Megan Terry, who was early on part of, have you heard of I think it was the first rock musical called Viet Rock? So it would have been in the 60s, and she was working with, in an ensemble of people who were making work together. She was also working with Joseph Chaikin at the Open Theater. Is that okay? So the Open Theater was an ensemble of people who were all disciplined, experienced theater people, but they were making work out of their own experience. Have you heard of a piece called The Serpent? Which was around, it's interesting because it was about the theme of the first time. You know, the first time, that there's been a first time for everything at some point. And so in this play, the climax of this piece was the Kennedy assassination, right? Because that was the first time America had such a significant assassination. It wasn't the first assassination. But so I was interviewing Megan Terry. She was going to a performance that was a rehearsal in, of all places, the police academy, because there's there are all these strange, interesting relationships of groups in New York. And so I went with her to see this rehearsal of a piece called The Serpent. And it was amazing. I hadn't seen anything like it. It was, the transformational work, the way we went from character to where are we? What is going on here? But it wasn't like I can't stand this. It was like fascinating. And in the end, they all introduced themselves, said their real names on the stage in theater in New York City. They didn't pretend they were someone else or deny that they were there. They were just being themselves. And there was a photo. They each carried a photo with them. So, breaking those kind of rules was so exciting. And where criticism became involved was, I think it was a guy named Michael Smith, who was a critic for the Village Voice, who was invited to be embedded, I suppose, in a way, but to follow the work, because the wish was to make the work clear to audiences so that they would bring audiences with them, so that when they were first writing about it, they were writing, the people writing, like Michael Smith, writing from the inside out to say, this is what we're doing.
Which is the kind of Hamburgian model of dramaturgs, is to have a critic embedded into a theatre process.
Yeah. So I knew we'd get around to you in a minute.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, all the many of the early dramaturgs, and this is a European, specifically German tradition, were critics, and which makes sense. And as you was speaking, PJ, I was thinking of Kenneth Tynan, one of my favourite theatre critics, the great British theatre critic, and he
same era,
and the joke with him was, which was actually true, was that he criticized the National Theatre so often, and eventually he kind of said to them, essentially, if you bring me in, then I'll stop kind of writing terrible reviews of your work. And they did, and they brought him into the company. Essentially, I think it was either Gielgud or Olivier. Olivier, I think, kind of brought him in that sense. And in some ways, I think you could argue that they are uniquely positioned to do that, because historically there's this idea that critics are kind of surrogate audience members, or there's this idea, which I don't like that much, but gets put around a lot, which is that they kind of see as the audience sees, but better in a sense. And I would put that in kind of scare quotes, but yeah.
You have something to say?
I was just going to say, I just watched Ratatouille. Have you guys seen it?
No, but good segue.
No, it relates. There's a theatre critic in it. No, theatre critic. Restaurant critic. It's about an animatronic
Pixar,
rat.
Isn't it? Is it Pixar?
Yeah, it's a Pixar.
It's a film.
Animated film about a rat/chef. And it's really good. But the villain of the story is the food critic.
Yeah.
And it's crazy because I was especially since talking about starting this project with you guys, I thought, everyone who reviewed it was like, oh yeah, screw that guy, and he had it coming, and I totally had a different interpretation. I thought he was a great character and had constructive things to say about it. And I just wondered what your idea of the kind of person it takes to take feedback and criticism in the arts. And because you said you've worked with some people who are stung, but then they take it on and they want to make it better. And I don't know if you guys want to go there already, but we could talk about criticism in Adelaide or feedback in the performing arts, and how we talk about all these great things and things we love about it, but there's this stiltedness in the performing arts that you can feel because for broader reasons people don't want to hear it, or for personal reasons they don't want to hear criticism. And I wonder what your insight is into that.
Let's go there.
Well, I just wanted to pick up quickly on something Jules said in regards to Ratatouille, actually, which is the idea of the critic as the villain, because I'm sure, isn't that a convention is it Birdman? The film that came out, isn't the main villain in that a critic as well? Yeah. Which I think is, I just think that's interesting that's, there aren't that many kind of pop cultural representations of critics, and in both of those films they're kind of set up to be these villains. And I think that's kind of a problematic model if within kind of pop culture we don't have another way of talking about what critics do. And historically I think there are plenty of examples of critics. Kenneth Tynan is one of them, who in some cases had very close relationships to authors, and in many cases were kind of early champions of work that other people weren't championing. Harold Pinter is one example, and so on. Although I think Tynan wasn't that keen on Pinter's early work. I don't think he didn't get it, and may have even written a review as a parody of a Pinter play, which is quite funny. I think it's Pinter, maybe it's Beckett. One of them. One of them.
Do you find it difficult being an artist and a critic at the same time? How does that?
Well, the old joke is it's like an arsonist working for the fire department, which is kind of partly true, but I think partly I've always just thought of them as very much kind of separate hats. And I do think there are many interesting crossovers that go both ways. And one way that I used to think of this was, if you're a critic of, let's say, contemporary drama, which I am, contemporary theatre, then doesn't there naturally come a point where you want to try your hand at the thing that you profess to know how it works, right? And especially as a dramaturg, I'm someone who, I think I have some grasp of what works and doesn't work on a stage. And so there was a moment where I thought, well, surely I want to put that into practice and, and try my hand at playwriting, which I'm still doing. I don't know that I honestly don't think I've written, I don't think I've written a really good play yet. I think I'm capable of doing it, or at least I'm interested in finding out if I'm capable of doing it. And it surprises me that critics might not be. And also I think it's much more common than people realize. There are many, many, many artist critics. I mean, I think it's more common in literature, for example, and actually it's in its own way, it's a criticism of, say, the Australian literary community, because there are so few avenues for writers to make money from their creative writing that many of them, kind of moonlight as critics of one kind or another. I think it's less common in theatre, but then I think of, say, probably my favourite Australian critic is Alison Croggan, who is also a playwright, a librettist, a poet, a fantasy fiction author. She does many other things. And ultimately I would say there's a young Indigenous critic, Declan Fry, who I really, really like. And, he kind of basically makes this point, which I've always agreed with, which is that criticism is just another kind of art form. It's not some rarefied thing that kind of sits in complete opposition or in some very kind of strange positionality to art. It is a form of art in itself, or it should be. I mean, ultimately that's my ambition for the criticism that I do, that it is actually art in itself, that it's well written, whatever that means, that it's kind of stylish, that it's interesting, that you might want to read it even if you're never going to go and see the show. Like that's the kind of criticism that I want to write and that I respond most well to, I think. I don't see criticism as this kind of throwaway, kind of parasitical kind of barnacle that's attached to the bottom of art. I think it's
clinging on
for dear life and kind of disfiguring the whole thing. I think it should be interesting in its own right, which is why, not to keep going back to him, but, I still read the reviews of Kenneth Tynan. I'm never going to see the shows that he wrote about, but he wrote about them so well that I think there's something about them that is enduring.
I agree. Same era, Robert Brewston, who was the chair of Yale Drama, I think, at the time. Some really fascinating articles about what they were doing, what kind of new discourse, unpanicked discourse they were trying to generate.
Yeah.
And they're very exciting. I always found that those criticisms, as we're using the word, very exciting, because they also recreated. That's the other thing I really appreciate about a good criticism. They recreate a way to see the show. So if we've missed the show, God, I should sit down and write about Sunday in the Park with George for you guys so you could experience it as I did. Seriously.
I'm glad you said that, PJ, because I was thinking of it the other day, that's a quality that I really admire in the criticism that I like as well, even if it is an essentially negative review of a work. I think if it's well enough written, it's possible to read that and go, okay, I get that the critic didn't get what was happening here, but me as the reader, as a potential theatre goer, I can see that there might be something in this work for me, regardless of what has been said about it in terms of, the kind of subjective appraisal that's happening there. So, and I think there is a real skill to that as well. And I think that idea of James Waite's an Australian critic who I really like, who unfortunately, passed a few years ago, but he's got this lovely line where he talks about the art of the critic is like describing something that's kind of carved on your soul, because theatre's so ephemeral, it's so fleeting. You can't point anyone to anything concrete, most likely. You can kind of point them towards an experience that they may or may not have, but that's as much as you can do. But I think, I think the art is in description. It's not in opinion. I think, and I think, again, I think people mistake criticism in a way for opinion writing, but I think often I think the kind of like, dislike, thumbs up, thumbs down, binaries, dichotomies, I think that's the least interesting part of criticism. And I think critics always need to some extent, to kind of park that temptation. Like, everybody leaves a show at the theatre and says to their friend, what did you think? Did you like it? And you might have that immediate reaction, but I mean, critics, if they're worth anything, they have to find some way of going beyond that reaction. Otherwise, I don't think it's I don't think it's anything more than a consumer guide. Going to your point about the three different sort of kinds of theatre, I think there are different kinds of criticism. And actually, in our kind of earlier discussion, we were kind of talking about maybe the difference between theatre and criticism, and between criticism and reviewing, and one definition of reviewing that it's more like a consumer guide, and criticism is perhaps more substantial and I think should be trying to, in the first instance, assess what was being attempted, and then it's only from there, I think, that you can kind of make some sort of judgment, no matter how subjective or objective it is, on whether that was successful or not. And I think that goes to the point I was making earlier about the kind of criticism that I appreciate even of my own work is where it feels like some attempt has been made to see what was being attempted, to understand it, even if it didn't work. To me, I think the most frustrating or disappointing criticism is where it feels like they may almost be writing about a different show, or they're judging a work by criteria that don't feel relevant.
It's good to hear you describe that, like, review criticism difference, and to unpack, what is useful about it. Because I think, I'm always coming at it from the performer's perspective, and just going to all the memories of just how, like, excruciating it felt for me personally to be critiqued in various ways. And, I've come to a different way in social work because it feels really useful and thoughtful, and I think I'm a person that needs just a bit more direct, just clear. Like, I can't surmise from your little, like, speech what I need to do in my next take. Like, I need you to just tell me 1, 2, 3, change that, go. And it was such a big part of my social work practice that I was like, why? I don't feel like it was that big of a part of drama school, that it was like, how to be a professional actor is also developing your professional practice in being reflexive, being self-reflective, being able to go back over your work and go, no, yeah, that didn't hit the mark, and I need to work on this, and this needs to be better, this needs to work. It was just something that was completely not talked about. And, you'd get sort of a grade or a comment here and there, and people might go and cry about it, and you'd have a talk with your best friend about it or something. But in my experience, I don't remember it being a skill that they tried to give to us. And I thought that is such a shame, because I think, without even that skill, just even before Drama Centre, I think I was very sensitive and took criticism badly. But I've realised that it is a skill to be able to take criticism, and to be able to understand and also differentiate between being able to hear it and not have a meltdown, and then deciding whether you take it, because they're two different things. It's okay to just, in a gracious space, be like, okay, thank you, or cheers for that. And then it's another thing to go off and decide in your mind whether you can have the humility to go like, okay, maybe they had a point. I kind of felt that way too. And to have this culture of going, can I have a mentor? Can I have someone who can guide me through how to take this criticism and apply it in a way where my ego doesn't feel so destroyed? And of course, that's just the performing perspective for me.
But I think that is broadly applicable. I mean, while you were speaking, I was thinking about a review of my first show, which Edwin directed, The Lake, which got a bad review in The Guardian, which was kind of...
The Guardian?
In The Guardian, which was really was really devastating to me at the time.
What did it say?
Quite an honour, though, The Guardian. Trashed me in The Guardian. Shit on me.
Well, I mean, partly I think it did what I don't like, which is that it did kind of hold the work up against standards that I don't think the work was setting for itself. But it also made some really good points that I couldn't see at the time. But looking back on it now, I don't think it was as misplaced as I thought it was at the time. But of course, in the moment, it's deeply painful. But particularly when in the case of that show, it was my first, kind of professional show. And I'd had such a kind of wonderful creative experience working on that. And then, to have what feels to you at the time in the moment, it's like, someone kind of, swans in and kind of grandly pronounces your work of failure.
Was that your only review?
No, I've had.
I mean, of that show.
No. Well, I mean, this is another thing. That was the only kind of really negative review of that show that I remember. But that's the thing, right? You remember. I think actors always say this. You remember your bad reviews, kind of word for word, and the good ones just kind of fall out of your brain, I think.
This was on the stage at the chapel at Holden Street,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Just placing it.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is that when you do a show, like I don't think we've talked about this yet, the way that the feedback that you get from the people around you is always, that was fantastic, well done, great job. Like it's so kind of superficial, overly positive, and sometimes just a lie. And then you get these kind of people that you have no contact with, no understanding of the context, like no conversation that can then write in, black and white, something that you feel like is going to, follow you for the rest of your life, this like determination on your work and your value. And there's nothing kind of in between, or there's no, bridging of those two things.
Yeah, well, there's like, everything is through social work because I'm consumed in that. But I have this mentor guy who talks about the self as like, there's the core, the inner you that no one ever gets to see. It's just you, your values, your beliefs. And then there's the outer shell of you that is people's perception of your behavior, your actions, your attitudes, and what you put into the world. And how you can't blame people for only being able to see that, because that's the only relationship they really have to you. And when people criticize what you do and what you put out, you can separate and go, I don't feel attacked in my core. They're just criticizing what they can see that I've put there. And I think if you can think about yourself as an artist in that way, you don't have to, because I know a lot of artists that are very resistant to just hearing sometimes anything good or bad about themselves, and there's just this kind of energy of like, don't, and then you did good, everything's great. But I think it's a mindset, it's an attitude, it's a belief about the self and art and criticism that has to shift to facilitate that culture to change.
Well, it's interesting how difficult, I can imagine being an actor, how that would be so, one would be much more fragile, you'd think, as an actor than as a director or stage designer. But I don't know where to go with that, except to say that I'm not really interested in saying that was good, that wasn't very good. But I want to, like, the image that's obsessing me at the moment is the central image from Watershed of this image of this dancer hanging suspended by his feet over live water, while the two different choirs sang the lyrics written by Chilkas and Alana Valentine of an incident that happened here in Adelaide. And even though, other things happened kind of, but that was this central image that's just there, and this gorgeous music, absolutely gorgeous, that you wouldn't hear anywhere on public air in Adelaide except at Easter or, seriously. And it wasn't just the music, though. It was that combination of, and I so wish there was a CD available, because the music is, I just knew I would have the whole thing memorized if I could only hear it one more time, and I only heard it twice. So, but yeah, I'm interested in how that kind of combination of image, the image, sound that become more than themselves, that just becomes so powerful. And how does metaphor work? Those great old questions that's what excites me, is that kind of stuff.
I just to say quick, I mean, I didn't see Watershed, which I deeply regret, because it's one of the festival shows that most people kind of seem to talk about. But I kind of wonder, from the reviews that I read, if that opening image was actually kind of in a way too good, because quite a few of the reviewers kind of said that show started so well and then kind of lost its way a little and became a bit didactic towards the end. Edwin's shaking his head.
I have a high tolerance for didactic work, so yeah, maybe it was didactic, but it was fantastic the whole way through. Yeah. It was incredible.
It was incredible all the way through.
Right.
Yeah, and also because it was so much a part of our personal lives, our personal interests, our personal politics. I went to the talk that I think the library sponsored at Elder Hall or something with Cholkas and Valentine, and they this was an early preview of, they think they played one of the songs or something in Elder Hall. The guy who wrote the book on which they based the arc of the narrative was sitting on the side. And at the end of when this little choir sang one of the songs, the guy who wrote the book was in tears, and that made me even more determined to go see the whole show, because he was so lovely. I mean, he was an historian, and there he was sobbing in Elder Hall. It was great.
And doesn't that speak to the beautiful kind of localization of theatre that we were talking about before? Because how often would you get the chance to have an experience like that in the cinema? Probably never. Maybe again at a very local level, let's say the Adelaide Film Festival, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, that feels special to theatre.
Yeah.
And just to add as well, one of the things that I think it'd be great for us to do is to not just talk about our views on a work, but also talk about kind of what you're saying, how is a work made? Like, how do you, if something's amazing, how do you create something amazing? Like how are these moments constructed, and to kind of like, not just assess something, but try to get inside it and try to work out what the artists have done to make that. I think that'll be really exciting.
Well, we're all in agreement. I think that's a good way to move on.
Yeah, I think some final thoughts for me are that I really want to find a way to, I'm just even listening to you, I feel like I'm starting to absorb these new words, this sort of language around discussing theatre and performing arts, and I'm excited to get back into it. And my sort of vernacular might be a bit more casual, or, a layman's interpretation of something, but I'm just keen to get that going when talking about the plays that we see.
Yeah. I mean, I hope we've kind of demonstrated one of the things that I think we're all keen to do, which is to really kind of narrow, I think, the gap between, in a way, the public discourse about theatre, which I think has been so much subsumed into the PR industry, and the private conversations, the ones that happen, perhaps not even in the foyer afterwards, but outside the foyer, that's outside the theatre afterwards. And I think there's real value to that. And from, personal experience, I think there's much more to be gained through striving for a kind of fearlessness than trying to tell people what they want to hear.
And next episode, Jules and Ben are going to be reviewing Grief Lightning, which was on at Rumpus Theatre.
Looking forward to it.
Can't wait.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
So the show is about the popular Reddit theory that Sandy drowns at the beginning of Greece, and the rest is her coma fantasy. So it kind of looks at like online meme culture and death and grief and all these kind of wild theories that everyone can relate to.
And can you talk about what audiences, how they've responded to the show in the past?
So audiences have been surprisingly receptive to the show, which is a choice, and a choice that has allowed the lecturer here to do 2 runs of the show beforehand, and has kind of encouraged Rumpus to let them back into this space for the first time. So audiences have been, surprisingly positive and receiving it super well.
And what's been your role in the project?
Yeah, so I'm the producer. I have been helping the lecturer out in kind of putting this show on. Can't say it's been the easiest thing in the world, but art and academia is really important, and it's been really exciting to be able to produce a work like this.
And what should audiences expect to get from the show?
That's a really great question. Do you know? Okay, great. So audiences should expect to kind of see a popular piece of media that they may or may not have seen in a new light for the very first time. I think they should expect to see something out of the ordinary, and to also see something really relatable. I think just come along, support your local independent theatre. Maybe don't support this person, but the team around it is really great. And, it shows, unfortunately, more than one person.